In the future, we will create many view models, but when creating, some view models do not need data, but only methods. After we create an app, we usually refactor the app for later maintenance convenience. As you do that, the widget gets smaller and smaller. In other words, the scope of what a widget has to do becomes smaller and smaller. Consider an app like what you see on your screen. There is text field at the top. The number entered in this text field determines how much is incremented when the increment button shown below is pressed. The two text widgets below the text field display the current increment size and counter value respectively. You can group all the widgets displayed on the screen under one store connector, but I'll make the text field a separate widget and combine the other two text widgets and the elevated button widget to make another widget. Create an app called Distinct3 and start with the basic functions of the app already created. Let's take a look at what has already been created. I have installed Equatable, Flutter Redux as packages to be used by the app. And I removed the avoid print command from the analysis options.yaml file to prevent warnings when using the print statement in the app. I'll explain the folders. This app is a single-page app as you saw on the screen. Under the Pages folder, there is a homepage.dot file that displays this page itself and an increment size.dot file that displays a widget called increment size used by homepage.dot. There are counter and increment size folders under the Redux folder, each of which stores counter-related state, action, reducer, and increment size-related state, action, and reducer. And under the Redux folder, there are appstate.dot and appreducer.dot, each of which stores the app-wide state and reducer. From now on, let's look at the counter state in order. Counter state is a state that manages counter. I declared a final variable counter of int type and create a constructor, props, toString, and copy it using the .data class generator. And create the factory constructor called counterState.initial to use as an initial state and return a countState instance with a count value of 0. Next, let's look at the counter-related actions. There is only one action called increment action. Since increment action is an action that instructs to increase the counter value by the increment size input by the user, it receives the current increment size value as an argument. Let's look at the counter reducer. The counter reducer takes the previous count state and action as an argument and returns a new counter state. If action is increment action, use the copied function of state to create a new state whose counter value is the current counter value, state.counter plus action.increment size, and return it. Next, let's look at increment size. Let's start with increment size state first. Increment size state is the state that manages increment size. I declared a final variable increment size of int type and create a constructor, props, toString, and copy it using the .data class generator. And created a factory constructor called increment size state.initial to use as an initial state and return an increment size state instance with an increment size value of 1. Next, let's look at the actions related to increment size. Since set increment size action is an action that sets the increment size as much as the increment size value entered by the user, it receives the increment size value set by the user as an argument. Let's look at the increment size reducer. The increment size reducer takes the previous increment size state and action as an argument and returns a new increment size state. If action is a set increment size action, use the copied function of state to create a new state whose increment size value is action.incrementSize and return it. Next, let's look at appstate. Appstate is a combination of counter state and increment size state. I declare the counter state type final variable counter state and the increment size state type final variable increment size state and create the constructor, props, toString, and copy with. And to use it as an initial state, I create a factory constructor called appstate.initial. returns an instance with a count state value of count state.initial and an increment size state value of increment size state.initial. Next, let's look at app reducer.out. Reducer receives app state type state and action as argument and returns a new app state. The value of the counter state argument of app state is calculated by counter reducer, and the value of the increment size state argument is calculated by the increment size reducer. Next, let's go to main.dart. I declare the store type late final variable store. In the main function, I created the store instance of app state type and assigned it to the store variable. App-wide reducer and initial state are required as arguments of store instance. Give a reducer function created under Redux folder as value and app state the initial factory constructor as the initial state value. The store is injected into the widget tree using store provider. Next, let's look at the UI.